Hey, what's up, mortals? It is I, the Silent Sheepdog, here with a new video for you. Welcome to part 8 of What If Deku Had the System. Just wanted to greet you guys by saying, sit back, relax, you're in for a treat. And so, we begin. The field was littered with students, but wasn't crowded. They all stuck to their own groups, smithing their plans with hushed voices. The whispers all had their unique tone and scheme, but one thing seemed to be mutual amongst most of them. No matter what tone they used, no matter what they thought of it, everyone had one specific target in mind. This was none other than the head that was worth more than 10 million points, Izuku Midoriya. The green-haired boy was well aware of the obvious target on his back, but it didn't bother him in the slightest. He had a vague idea of what the other teams could be capable of, and he also had a plan. His team, however, didn't know the full implications of said plan. Izuku had only asked them to trust him, and they did. The students prepared themselves fully, mounting up their teams as they did. They all stood in their formations, ready to charge at any moment. Then, as Izuku tightly wrapped his headband, it began.
"Start!"
Present Mike shouted, and no time was wasted. All the teams did just as expected. They went straight for the 10 million pointer. Izuku and his team did the only thing that made sense for their situation. They ran away. They had already acknowledged that they would win as long as they kept their own headband, so there was no need to go hunting for points. Of course, running away was much easier said than done. Team Midoriya wasn't very mobile. Even when Uraraka used her quirk to make them lighter, they were barely escaping everyone's grasp. The primary reason that they hadn't had their headbands snatched yet was the joint effort between Izuku and Tokoyami. The green-haired boy used his telekinesis to push away anyone who got close, while Tokoyami did the same to cover their blind spots. This almost gave them a flawless defense, but there was something peculiar about their lineup. Kirishima, their strongest and sturdiest member, was placed in the back. The front horse of their team was Tokoyami, which almost wasted Kirishima's abilities. He could still be helpful in the back, but they all knew that he would have been better off as the front horse. The truth was, however, that the team didn't know why their team was built the way that it was. They had only done as Izuku instructed, which must have meant that he had something planned. The other teams also noticed this formation, but they didn't know what to think of it. Some of them knew that Kirishima was better off in the front, but they didn't know what to think when seeing this. To them, it looked like Izuku was making a mistake, and they were going to take advantage of it. Team Midoriya did everything they could, but it wasn't enough. It was only a matter of time before they were backed into a corner, and then it would be over. Izuku and his team kept struggling without end, desperately trying to get away. They didn't slow down at all. They couldn't afford to. They would keep going until an opening was presented, and an opening eventually came. The team had managed to push everyone back, so now there was a path cleared for them. No time was wasted as they rushed for it, but they were immediately stopped. Suddenly, a massive wall of ice appeared in front of them, blocking their escape route completely. "You're not going anywhere," a cold voice then called out, one that everyone recognized. Izuku turned to see that it was Todoroki, standing ready with his team. The two teams stared at each other in silence. They all knew why Team Todoroki was there. They were just waiting for the other to make a move. That is when the silence was broken by Todoroki, who said, "It's your move now. There's nowhere to run. So what'll you do?" while sounding both cold and intimidating. Both teams were a little surprised to hear this, for it sounded like Todoroki was trying to taunt Izuku. The latter's team all hoped that the words hadn't managed to reach him, but that wasn't the case. Izuku had been mildly irritated by Todoroki's words, more than he should have been. The others seemed to notice this and waited for his response, only to see him reach his hand out towards the ice wall. Everyone was once again confused, wondering what Izuku was trying to do. Then suddenly, a huge portion of the ice began to shake, confusing everyone even further. They didn't realize what was happening until they turned their attention back to Izuku, his outstretched arm now tense. "There's no way he can do that, right?" Kaminari then asked, sounding a little scared as he did. His teammates were all asking themselves the same question, all while hoping that their anticipation wouldn't come true. Then the ice cracked, as if responding to their concerns. Team Todoroki now looked terrified, for their fears seemed to be coming true. Izuku was going to strike them all down, and there seemed to be nothing they could do about it. They all just stared into Izuku's narrowed eyes as the ice cracked more and more. Then, out of nowhere, an explosion could be heard. Izuku turned towards it, only to let go of the ice once he saw what it was. "Deku!" The loud and angry voice of Bakugo shouted as he dove toward them from the sky. This battle cry made Izuku shift his focus, turning his other arm towards the blonde. But just as they were going to make an impact, Bakugo was pushed back by Dark Shadow. Izuku was caught off guard by this, as Tokoyami then shouted, "Keep going, Midoriya!" before turning his attention back to the field. Izuku didn't have enough time to react, as another stream of ice was shot towards them. Once again, it was stopped by his team, who had angled themselves so that Kirishima could stop the ice with his hardening. "Don't mind these guys. We can handle them," the redhead then shouted, sounding just as serious as Tokoyami. Izuku was rather speechless, unsure of what to think about this, as he then turned to look at his adversaries. Both Team Bakugo and Todoroki were gunning for him at the same time, but they didn't seem to be cooperating. By the looks of it, they were only taking advantage of the situation that the other had caused, which was probably why they were able to manage it. This, however, also meant that if they did decide to cooperate, the tables would turn immediately. On this note, Izuku turned his attention back to the ice wall, using both of his hands this time. His team worked their hardest, defending themselves from any oncoming attacks. Their enemies didn't stop for a second, and the situation only grew more dire. Then, as it looked as if all was lost, another loud crack could be heard. Everyone stopped in their tracks as a massive shadow loomed over them. They all looked up to see what it was, only for their hearts to skip a beat. What they saw was a giant boulder of ice floating over them like an airborne island. Both opposing teams already knew that this was Izuku's doing, which made things worse because there was only one thing that could possibly happen next. Therefore, both teams panicked as they ran for their lives. They didn't manage to get far, however, until the ice began to fall towards them. Without any forewarning, the ice crashed down with a loud bang. The shock wave could be felt by many, as a thick and frosty fog now covered the area. Everyone in the arena was now speechless. They had seen Izuku use an incredible amount of power before, but they were still shocked by how destructive it was. Even his own teammates were stunned to silence, as they stared at what could only be described as a frozen grave. Did that do it?" Kirishima asked, still sounding a little shell-shocked. Izuku sighed, as he shook his head while saying, "No, I wouldn't count on it," with a calm voice, before pointing towards the fog. Everyone turned their attention to the mist, as it was clearing up, only to see that Izuku was right once again. Through the fog, they could see Team Todoroki, seemingly unharmed thanks to their leader's efforts. Next to them was Team Bakugo, who didn't look to be as stable as the former. Izuku's teammates were speechless, as they began panicking a little. If their opponents were unharmed, it meant that they could attack again, and there was no guarantee that they would make it out this time. They all turned to Izuku for a plan, who strained his eyes more before saying, "Tokoyami, I need you to have Dark Shadow ready. Release it when I tell you to," with a more serious tone. Tokoyami was a little confused, but he did as his captain ordered. Izuku had his attention locked onto Team Todoroki. He could tell that they were planning something, so he couldn't afford to hold back. A pitch-black shadow covered the floor of the area, but no one seemed to notice it. This was one of Izuku's new abilities, Monarch's Domain, but he wasn't sure that it would work. Initially, he had hoped to have to use any shadow-related powers, but now he needed to make an exception. It was for the sake of this that Tokoyami had been made a front horse in the first place. The two teams stared each other down, both waiting for the right moment to strike. Everyone had one mutual feeling. What happened next would decide everything. Then, out of nowhere, Ida shouted, "Recipro, burst!" as blue flames jetted from his mufflers. In a split second, the entirety of Team Todoroki dashed across the field, much faster than could be perceived. To them, it was all settled. They were getting that headband. Or so they thought. Just as quickly as he had started, Ida was stopped before he could even reach his opponent. They were all stunned to silence, as they looked up to see what had stopped him. It was a giant and menacing hand made from darkness, bearing a claw-like shape. They all knew that it belonged to Dark Shadow, but they couldn't even seem to recognize it anymore. The shadow creature now looked more monstrous than before, looming over them with its blood-red eyes. They were frozen in fear and shock, until Dark Shadow knocked them out of it by pushing them back. Team Todoroki regained their senses and proceeded to fight the monster, but it couldn't be stopped. No matter how many times Ida tried to charge past it, no matter how much ice was thrown at it, it just wouldn't budge. The only thing that seemed to do any form of damage was Kaminari's electricity, but they were only able to use it once. Even so, Dark Shadow pretended as if nothing had happened mere seconds after getting hit. Team Todoroki grew more desperate as time passed, but it suddenly got much worse. Ida's engines stopped working, meaning that they could no longer maneuver properly. As if on cue with this, Dark Shadow took another swing. This one landed with full force, sending Team Todoroki flying. They then crashed, desperately trying to hold themselves together as the nightmarish shadow approached them. They could all feel their blood pumping faster in their veins until they began to hear their own heartbeats. Dark Shadow approached slowly, looking sadistic and uncontrollable as it did. "Stop!" a powerful voice then called out. Dark Shadow stopped in its tracks before looking over its shoulder, and Team Todoroki followed its eyes. It was looking at Izuku. He was the one that had called out to the beast. "They're defeated. Restrain yourself," the green-haired boy then said, with the same voice as before. Dark Shadow seemed to be annoyed at first, but it didn't fight back. It backed off, as if it couldn't disobey Izuku for some reason. Everyone was shocked, even the other teams. They all saw how violent Dark Shadow had been. There was no way it would ever listen to any form of reason. Yet, without any retaliation whatsoever, it obeyed Izuku. No one could make any sense of this. Not even Tokoyami. They were just left to wonder, as time finally ran out. This video is sponsored by NordVPN. Staying safe online is an ever-growing difficulty, and hackers could exploit you. NordVPN allows you to change your IP address, making you harder to track, securing your privacy. In addition to providing you with safe passage through the web, you can also expand the reach of your favorite streaming services. Are you tired of going through 2, 3, or even 4 streaming services to watch your favorite anime? Well, with NordVPN, you can change your country and be able to binge shows like My Hero Academia, Naruto, and many others on your favorite streaming services with just the press of a button. Check out the link in the description to get 72% off when buying for 2 years, $3.29 a month. This deal is for a limited time, and thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. President Mike was quick to announce the end of the battle, and the teams were a little relieved to hear it after seeing Dark Shadow go on a rampage. Izuku's teammates all wanted answers for what had happened, and Izuku explained as well as he could. He told them that he had the ability to enhance his own shadows and wanted to try using it on Dark Shadow, but he didn't expect it to work so well. Honestly, he didn't know that it would work at all. His teammates were somewhat satisfied with this answer. They were a little annoyed, but it wasn't anything too serious. Tokoyami then wanted to ask how Izuku managed to control Dark Shadow, but before he could, he was interrupted by Todoroki. The bi-colored teen didn't say much. He only wished to speak to Izuku, and the greenette complied. Now they were standing alone in a corridor, staring at each other in silence. Only one of them knew why they were there, but he wasn't talking. Izuku had been dragged there, so he didn't want to be the first person to speak. But right now, he was growing far too impatient. "Are you going to say something? If so, do you plan on putting me to sleep with another declaration of war?" the green-haired boy asked, his voice showing just how impatient he was getting. Todoroki didn't seem to budge upon hearing this, as he looked at his left hand. The room fell silent once again, with Todoroki just staring at his own hand, until he said, "I saw what you did, Midoriya," with his usual cold voice. Izuku was now a little confused, but he didn't get to ask about it before Todoroki continued. "During the cavalry battle, you used your hidden quirk to enhance Dark Shadow." Now Izuku's confusion vanished. He thought that this fact had been rather obvious, at least to those that knew the power existed, but he still didn't know what Todoroki was trying to say. "I'm getting sleepy, Todoroki. Where are you going with this?" the green-haired boy said, attempting to speed things along. Todoroki was still unfazed as he looked at Izuku before asking, "Tell me, Midoriya, have you ever heard of quirk marriages?" with the same cold voice. Izuku did not know what a quirk marriage was, but it still didn't prepare him for what was coming. Todoroki told him about his father, Endeavor, how he abused him as a child and even drove his mother to insanity. He was the product of a quirk marriage, a perfect combination between ice and fire, but he refused to use his father's quirk. Izuku was shocked to hear this. It wasn't something that he had expected. He already suspected a reason for Todoroki to never use his flames, but this was not what he imagined. The green-haired boy was about to show pity, until Todoroki spoke again. When you used your darkness, I instinctively activated my flames, but I stopped using them immediately after. You pushed me to do something I swore I would never do, and you did it by doing the same thing as me, the bicolored teen said, sounding a little more upset now. Izuku was now lost once again as he waited for Todoroki to continue. The bicolored teen took a deep breath, calming himself, before he continued. The other day, you told us that you didn't like your quirk, that you were afraid of it. Earlier today you reacted oddly, all while insisting not to use your other quirk. I only managed to piece it together after remembering another thing that you said, that your quirk probably came from a dark place. Izuku was starting to get a little nervous now. Todoroki seemed to be deducing something in his head, and it could end up leading to Izuku's darkest secret. Todoroki noticed this reaction, and it only made him more confident in what he was saying. The two teens stared at each other, eager to see and hear the end of this, as Todoroki spoke up. Tell me, Midoriya, are you just like me? Are you also the product of a quirk marriage? Izuku was now frozen, but it wasn't for the reasons that Todoroki thought. Going through everything, you could see a reason as to why the bicolored teen would believe this, only it was horribly wrong. This relieved Izuku, for Todoroki's deduction had been nothing more than a pointless conspiracy theory. The green-haired boy was silent for a while, until he chuckled lightly. Todoroki was confused by this, as Izuku then spoke up. Is that all you wanted to say? What a waste of time, he said, while still chuckling a little. Todoroki was still confused, and Izuku sensed it. That's when he turned serious and said, Todoroki, I am nothing like you. I hold back to stay under the radar because I don't need my full strength to win. You, on the other hand, do it to hold a grudge against your father. Had you actually used your flames during the cavalry battle, you would have defeated Dark Shadow. And then you could have won. With his usual cold voice. Todoroki was frozen upon hearing this, as if he didn't believe what he was hearing. Izuku was just getting more annoyed, both by Todoroki's words and his pointless grudge. It was the fact that the bicolored teen was so desperate to justify his own actions that he forced his own fantasies onto other people. Izuku felt everything boil up within him as he looked to his own shadow. That's when he remembered that its usual occupant wasn't there. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves as he said, You've wasted enough of my time, quite angrily, before leaving. Some time had passed. Now it was time for the third round. It was the usual tournament, the part that people remembered more than the others. It had a rather unusual start, with Ojiro and a student from Class 1B dropping out for their own reasons, but the matches were quickly drawn. Izuku would go up first against a student named Hitoshi Shinso, and it didn't look like he had anything to worry about. That is, when Ojiro warned him about Shinso's quirk, that if he spoke to him he would get brainwashed. Izuku was grateful for this information, for it meant that he really didn't have anything to worry about. However, his head was barely in the game. He was still thinking about Todoroki, about what Bakugo had said earlier, about everything. There was so much going on that he could barely keep up with it, and he could barely understand his surroundings. Begin! Midnight then shouted, snapping Izuku back to reality. He was already in the ring, and Shinso was already in front of him. The green-haired boy was still sticking to his plan of staying silent, but that didn't stop the maelstrom in his head. All his thoughts, stress, and anxiety was piling up within him, and Shinso's constant rain of insults wasn't helping. Eventually he had had enough, bursting out in a rage before grabbing Shinso with telekinesis. Naturally, the purple-haired teen panicked, but there was nothing he could do. He couldn't fight back as Izuku picked him up and then threw him out of the ring with full force. The entire audience was stunned into silence as they watched the unconscious Shinso that was almost buried into a concrete wall. Then Midnight snapped out of it as she announced, "Shinso is out of bounds! Midoriya advances to the second round!" Before the arena burst out into cheers. Izuku walked out of the ring in silence, trying to sort his head out, all while worrying some of his classmates. Thank you all for sticking around, and I hope you enjoyed. Before you leave, we would like to let you know that We the Celestials has many other channels for your entertainment and viewing purposes. All the information you need is right here below in the description, so feel free to check out all the other incredible projects that our team creates. Secondly, on behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. That's all for today's video, so goodbye and have a divine day.